"Ma'am, the President of the Republic would like to personally meet you." Those words stopped every conversation in the room, every camera, every breath, because the security agent wasn't talking to my adoptive father, the host of this charity banquet. He wasn't talking to my sisters, who'd spent the last hour posing for photos and giving interviews about their last family's philanthropic legacy. He was talking to me, the black girl in the server's uniform, holding a tray of champagne glasses, trying to stay invisible in the corner of the ballroom that used to be my home. You know what they say about karma? Sometimes it doesn't just knock on your door. Sometimes it lands on your front lawn in a private jet with the most powerful man in the world as a passenger. My name is Corlette, and this is the story of how I went from being the unwanted adopted daughter thrown out with nothing but a box of letters to standing in front of television cameras as my billionaire boyfriend introduced me as his future wife, while the president shook my hand. But before I tell you how I got here, let me ask you something. How's your day going? Where are you watching this from? I hope wherever you are, you're somewhere that feels like home. Because home is something I spent most of my life searching for. If you're someone who's ever felt like you didn't belong, like you were always trying to prove your worth to people who had already decided you weren't enough, then this story is for you. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what happened next changed everything. I thought I knew about family, love, and justice. But let me start from the beginning, back when I still believed that if I just tried hard enough, I could earn my place in the Morrison family. I was 7 years old when Margaret and Robert Morrison adopted me from foster care. Margaret had always wanted another daughter, she told me later, and she fell in love with my bright smile, and the way I could already read chapter books while other kids my age were still learning their letters. I thought I was the luckiest girl in the world. The Morrison house was everything I'd dreamed of during my 3 years bouncing between foster homes. A real bedroom with built-in bookshelves, a backyard with a swing set, 2 older sisters, Rebecca and Catherine, who I imagined would teach me how to braid my hair and share their secrets. Margaret was everything I'd hoped for in a mother. She read to me every night, helped me with my homework, and bragged to her friends about my straight A's. When I won the school science fair in 3rd grade, she hung my ribbon on the refrigerator right next to Rebecca's soccer trophy and Catherine's art award. "You're just as smart as your sisters," she would whisper to me at bedtime. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But even at 7, I wasn't blind. I could see the faded way Robert's jaw tightened when Margaret praised me. I could hear Rebecca and Catherine whispering about how I didn't really look like the family in our Christmas photos. I could feel the crested indifference in the way people looked at us when we went out together. Still, I believed that love could overcome anything. Margaret loved me, and that felt like enough. I threw myself into being the perfect daughter, perfect grades, perfect behavior, perfect gratitude for everything they'd given me. By high school, I was valedictorian, captain of the debate team, and had early admission to 3 Ivy League schools. I thought surely by then, I'd proven myself worthy of being a Morrison. I was wrong. The cracks had always been there, but they became impossible to ignore during my senior year. Robert never came to my debate competitions. Even when I won state championships, Rebecca and Catherine had stopped pretending to be proud of my achievements years earlier, rolling their eyes whenever Margaret praised my latest academic success. "She's just trying so hard," I heard Catherine tell her friend on the phone one day. "It's honestly embarrassing how desperate she is to fit in." The word desperate hit me like a slap. Was that what I was? Desperate. But Margaret was still there, still my champion, still the weighted mother who believed in me when no one else did. As long as she was alive, I had a place in this family. As long as she loved me, I belonged somewhere. I held on to that belief all through college, even when the rest of the family made it clear I wasn't welcome at holiday gatherings, unless Margaret specifically asked me to come. Even when Robert would introduce me to his friends as Margaret's project instead of his daughter. Even when Rebecca got engaged and didn't ask me to be in her wedding, Margaret was my anchor. My proof that the Morrison name meant something to me beyond just the letters on my birth certificate. When she got sick during 6 Little Bowed, my junior year of college, I came home every weekend to take care of her. When she died, suddenly of a heart attack during my senior year, I thought my heart would stop too. But I Never imagined that losing Margaret would mean losing everything else. The will reading happened 3 days after the funeral. I sat in the lawyer's office between Rebecca and Tablettle. Catherine, still wearing the black dress Margaret had bought me for job interviews. Still, believing that family meant something even in death. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading. The house went to Robert. The investments and savings were divided between Dotlaid, Rebecca, and Catherine. Margaret's jewelry collection, her art, even her books were distributed among her biological children. And to Corlett Morrison, the lawyer continued, and my heart lifted slightly. Margaret leaves her personal correspondence collection contained in one wooden box currently stored in the attic. Letters. She left me letters. Rebecca actually laughed. Out loud. That's it. Just some old papers. I felt my cheeks burning with humiliation, but I told myself that maybe there was something special in those letters. Maybe Margaret had left me something more meaningful than money or jewelry. Maybe she'd left me words that would help me understand why she'd loved me when no one else could. I was still clinging to that hope. 3 days later, when Robert knocked on my bedroom door and told me I had until the end of the week to find somewhere else to live. This house belongs to the family now, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. Margaret's gone, and it's time for you to make your own way in the fat world. But I am family, I whispered, hating how small my voice sounded. Robert's expression didn't change. You were Margaret's charity case, Corlett. You always have been. We tolerated you because she wanted us to, but she's not here anymore. It's time to stop pretending you belong here. That night, I climbed into the attic and found the wooden box. Margaret had left me. Inside were dozens of letters, some in envelopes, some loose. My hands shook as I opened the first one. It was a letter I'd written to Margaret when I was 8 years old, thanking her for adopting me and promising to make her proud. At the bottom in her handwriting, she'd written, "You already make me proud every single day. Love, Mom." Every letter in that box was something I'd written to her over the years. Every thank you note, every Mother's Day card, every letter from college telling her about my classes and my dreams. She'd kept them all. Every single one. But at the very bottom of the box, I found something else. A sealed envelope with my name, written in Margaret's shaky handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before she died. This is where my story really begins, because inside that envelope was a truth that would change everything I thought I knew about my place in the Morrison family and set in motion the events that would bring a private jet to my former home's front lawn. But I'll need you to stay with me for what comes next, because what I discovered in that letter led me down a path I never could have imagined. Hit that like button if you're ready to hear how everything I thought I knew about my adoption was a lie, and how that lie would eventually put me face with the President of the Republic. The story is just getting started. The letter in Margaret's handwriting was only 2 pages long, but it contained enough truth to rewrite everything I thought I knew about my life. "My dearest Corlett," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I can only pray that Robert has shown you more kindness than I fear he will. There are things I should have told you years ago. Things I was too much of a coward to say while I was alive. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely read the words, but I forced myself to continue. You were never supposed to be a charity case, sweetheart. Your birth mother, Sarah, was my college roommate and my dearest friend. When she got pregnant at 19 and I couldn't keep you, she made me promise to love you as my own. I didn't adopt you out of pity, Corlett. I adopted you because Sarah knew I would treasure the daughter she couldn't raise herself." The words blurred together as tears filled my eyes, but I kept reading. "Sarah died in a car accident when you were 3, just before we finalized the adoption. She never got to see you grow into the brilliant, beautiful woman you've become, but she left something for you, something Robert doesn't know about. In my safety deposit box, there's an envelope with your Cettery name on it, and inside that envelope is enough money to start whatever life you choose. Sarah wanted to make sure you would never be dependent on anyone else's kindness." The letter went on to give me the bank information and the location of a key hidden in her jewelry box, but I could barely process the practical details. Everything I'd believed about my adoption was wrong. I wasn't a charity case. I wasn't some random foster child Margaret had taken pity on. I was the daughter of her best friend, someone she'd promised to protect and love. And my birth mother had left me money. Enough money that I wouldn't have to beg Rebecca and Catherine for a place to stay, or gravel to Robert for more time to find somewhere to live. But the betrayal went deeper than just the lies about my adoption. As I sat in that attic surrounded by boxes of memories that weren't really mine, I realized that Margaret had kept this secret for almost 20 years. She'd let me believe I was unwanted, let me struggle to earn my place in a family that was never going to accept me when the truth was that I had every right to be there. The next morning, I went to the bank and opened the safety deposit box. Inside was more money than I'd ever imagined having, along with photos of my birth mother and letters she'd written to me before she died. Sarah looked exactly like me. Same dark skin, same bright eyes, same stubborn chin that Margaret used to say reminded her of someone she knew. Now I knew. Who? She'd been talking about my birth mother all along. For the first time in my life, I had choices, real choices. I could leave the Morrison house with dignity instead of desperation. I could start over somewhere completely new. Or I could go back to school and finish my degree without worrying about student loans. But first, I had to tell someone about what I discovered. Someone who would understand what it meant to finally know the truth about where you came from. The only person I could think of was Daniel. Daniel Chin had been my secret for 2 years. During college, we'd met in advanced economics where I was the only black student and he was the quiet Asian guy who always sat in the back row. Our professor paired us together for a semester-long project, and what started as study sessions in the library slowly became something deeper. Daniel wasn't like the other guys I'd met at school. He didn't try to impress me with stories about his family's money or his future plans to take over his father's business. He listened when I talked about feeling caught between two worlds, never quite fitting in anywhere. He understood what it felt like to carry the weight of other people's expectations on your shoulders. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, he told me one night as we walked across campus after spending hours in the computer lab working on our project. You're brilliant and kind and stronger than anyone I know. That's enough. I'd never had someone look at me the way Daniel did. Like I was exactly what they'd been searching for without even knowing they were searching. When he kissed me for the first time outside the library, I felt like I'd finally found the one place in the world where I belonged. We kept our relationship quiet at first because we were both focused on school, but also because I was scared. I'd never brought anyone home to meet the Morrison family, and I wasn't sure how they'd react to Daniel. Not because he was Asian, but because he represented something that was mine alone, something that they couldn't control or take away from me. For 6 months, Daniel and I built our own little world. We studied together, explored the city together, and made plans for after graduation. He wanted to work in sustainable technology, using his family's resources to fund environmental projects. I wanted to go to law school and focus on adoption rights and family law. We talked about changing the world together, about building something meaningful with our lives. Daniel was the first person who made me believe that love didn't have to be earned, that I didn't have to be perfect or grateful or constantly proving my worth. He loved me for exactly who I was, not for who I was trying to become. I should have known it was too good to last. The first crack appeared during Thanksgiving of my junior year. Margaret had invited me home for the holiday, and for the first time, I'd asked if I could bring someone. I'd been vague about Daniel, just saying he was a friend from school who didn't have anywhere else to go. Margaret said yes, immediately, the way she always did when I asked for anything. But when I walked into the house with Daniel beside me, the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Robert's handshake was firm but cold. Rebecca and Catherine were polite but distant. Only Margaret seemed genuinely happy to meet him, asking about his classes and his family with the same warm interest she'd always shown in my friends. But I could see the way Robert's eyes narrowed when Daniel mentioned that his father owned a tech company. I could hear the sharp edge in Rebecca's voice when she asked what Daniel's intentions were regarding me. I could feel the judgment radiating from every corner of the room. After dinner, while Daniel was helping Margaret with the dishes, Robert pulled me aside in his study. He seems like a nice enough young man, Robert said, settling behind his desk in a way that made it clear this was an interrogation. not a conversation. But I have to ask, Corlett, what exactly are you hoping to accomplish here? I don't understand what you mean. Don't play naive. It doesn't suit you. Robert leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same cold calculation he used when reviewing business contracts. This boy's family has money, real money, and you're a very attractive young woman with a very sad story. I just want to make sure you're being honest with yourself about what this relationship really is. The implication hit me like a physical blow. You think I'm using him. I think you're smart enough to recognize an opportunity when you see one. And I think this family has invested too much in you to watch you throw it all away, chasing some fantasy about love conquering all. Invested in me? The words came out, sharper than I'd intended. You mean Margaret invested in me? You've made it very clear that you never wanted me here. Robert's expression didn't change. Margaret has a soft heart, but she's not naive. She knows that your future depends on making practical choices, not romantic ones. This boy might be a pleasant distraction now, but what happens when his family realizes what he's gotten himself into? What happens when they start asking questions about yourself? Background? Your real family. The Morrisons are my real family. Are we? Robert's smile was sharp as a blade. Because last I checked, you don't actually have any legal claim to the round. Morrison name once you turn 18. Margaret adopted you. Yes, but adoption papers can be complicated things, especially when other family members have concerns about outside influences. I felt the blood drain from my face. What are you saying? I'm saying that your place in this family depends on you making choices that protect our reputation and our low interests. Dating some rich boy who's going to start digging into your history isn't protecting anything. It's creating problems we don't need. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what Robert had implied. Could he really challenge my adoption? Could he somehow take away the only family I'd ever known? More importantly, was he right about Daniel? Was I using him without even realizing it? Was our entire relationship built on some unconscious calculation on my part? Some desperate attempt to secure my future through someone else's wealth? The doubts Robert had planted grew over the next few weeks. Every time Daniel talked about his family, every time he casually mentioned something that reminded me of the difference in our backgrounds, I wondered if I was fooling myself about what we meant to each other. The end came 2 weeks later in the most devastating way possible. I was supposed to meet Daniel at our usual spot in the library, but I was running late after a meeting with my advisor about summer internships. When I finally got there, I heard voices coming from our usual study room. The door was slightly open, and, through the crack, I could see Daniel sitting across from Rebecca. My sister had never shown any interest in my college life before. She'd never even visited campus. But there she was, leaning across the table with tears in her eyes, her voice heavy with what sounded like genuine concern. I just think you should know what you're getting into, she was saying. Corlett is family and we love her, but she's been through so much trauma. The foster care system really damaged her ability to form healthy attachments. She gets obsessed with people who show her kindness, and she interprets normal friendship as something more serious. I felt my knees go weak. This wasn't happening. Rebecca wouldn't do this to me, but she kept talking, her voice full of fake sympathy. Our parents are worried about her. Honestly, she's never had a real relationship before, and they think she's projecting all her abandonment issues onto you. It's not fair to either of you. Daniel's voice was quiet when he responded. She seems very independent to me, strong. She is strong in some ways, but Daniel, she's also incredibly vulnerable underneath all that strength. She's told me how much your relationship means to her, how she's already planning your future together. I think she genuinely believes you're going to marry her. The words hit me like a physical blow because they were true. I had been thinking about a future with Daniel. I had been imagining what our life could look like after graduation. The thing is, Rebecca continued, her voice gentle and devastating, Corlett has never had anything that was really hers. She spent her whole life trying to find someone who would choose her permanently. And when she fixates on someone like that, she can become very intense, very demanding. It's not her fault, but it's not healthy either. I couldn't listen anymore. I turned and ran, my heart breaking with every step. That night, Daniel called me 17 times. I didn't answer. The next day, he showed up at my dorm room, but I pretended I wasn't there. For a week, he tried to reach me, tried to explain that whatever I heard wasn't the whole story. But Rebecca's words had poisoned everything. Every memory of our relationship was now tainted by the possibility that Daniel saw me as a damaged, desperate girl who'd misinterpreted his kindness. Every plan we'd made together now seemed like evidence of my own pathetic neediness. Finally, I sent him a single text message. Rebecca was right. I was reading too much into what we had. I think we should take a break and focus on. He tried to call me immediately, but I'd already blocked his number. 2 weeks later, I saw him across campus with a blonde girl from his finance class. They were just studying. Together, probably. But to me, it looked like proof that Rebecca had been right. He'd moved on. Easily. The way someone does when they've been relieved of an uncomfortable burden. I never spoke to Daniel again. Now, sitting in that attic with Margaret's letter in my hands, and the truth about my adoption finally revealed, I wondered what might have been different if I'd known than what I knew now. If I'd understood that I was never the charity case Robert had convinced me I was. If I'd had the confidence that comes with knowing your worth isn't dependent on other people's kindness. But it was too late for those regrets. Daniel was probably married to his finance classmate by now. And I was about to be thrown out of the only home I'd ever known. Or so I thought. What I didn't know was that Daniel had never forgotten me. What I didn't know was that he'd spent the last 3 years trying to find me, trying to understand why I disappeared from his life so suddenly. What I didn't know was that Rebecca's manipulation had failed in one crucial way. Daniel had never believed a word she'd said, and what I definitely didn't know was that the quiet boy from my economics class had just inherited his father's multi-billion-dollar technology empire, making him one of the most powerful men in the Republic. The revenge that was coming wouldn't be planned by me. I was too busy trying to survive, trying to figure out how to rebuild my life from nothing. But Daniel was planning something that would make the Morrison family's charity banquet a night they would never forget. I just had to get through the next few months first. I had to hit rock bottom before I could rise again. And trust me, rock bottom was coming fast. 3 days after I found Margaret's letter, Rebecca knocked on my bedroom door at 7 o'clock in the morning. "Daddy wants to see you in his office," she said, not bothering to hide the satisfaction in her voice. "Bring your things." I knew what this meant. My week of grace was up. I'd spent those 3 days in a real, strange kind of limbo, packing my belongings while trying to process everything I'd learned about my adoption. The money for my birth mother's inheritance was sitting in a new bank account, enough to start over anywhere I wanted. But somehow having financial security made the emotional devastation worse, not better. For the first time in my life, I didn't need the Morrison family's charity. I could leave with my head held high, knowing I had options and opportunities they'd never given me credit for. But that also meant I couldn't pretend anymore. That staying was about necessity. If I fought for my place in this house, it would be purely because I still, despite everything, wanted to belong here. And I wasn't sure I was strong enough to want something from people who had never wanted me back. Robert was sitting behind his desk when I entered his office, the same way he'd positioned himself during our conversation about Daniel. But this time, Catherine was there too, perched on the edge of a chair like she was attending a business meeting. "Sit down, Corlett," Robert said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. I remained standing. "I'll take my things and go. You don't need to make this into a formal eviction. Actually, we do need to make this formal." Robert opened a folder on his desk and pulled out several documents. "Margaret's death has raised some legal complications regarding your status in this family." My blood went cold. "What kind of complications?" Catherine leaned forward, her voice taking on the fake concerned tone I remembered from her conversation with Daniel. "The thing is, Corlett, when Daddy and Mother adopted you, they were very young and didn't fully understand all the legal implications. Adoption laws have changed a lot since then." "What are you saying, Robert?" slid a document across the desk toward me. I'm saying that your adoption was never fully finalized. Margaret handled most of the paperwork, and she was so eager to bring you home that she rushed through the process. There were some documents that were never properly. I stared at the papers in front of me, but the words seemed to swim together on the file. Paige, that's impossible. I've had your name for 15 years. You've used our name, Catherine corrected. But legally, you were only ever a foster placement with intention to adopt. The final adoption decree was never processed. The room started to spin. Margaret would have told me. Margaret wanted to protect you from complicated legal issues. Robert said, his voice taking on the patient tone you'd use with a confused child. She thought there would be time to sort everything out later. Unfortunately, later never came. I finally sat down, my legs unable to support me anymore. What does this mean? It means that legally you're not a Morrison, Catherine said. And I could hear the relief in her voice. You never were. You were a foster child in our care. And now that you're an adult, that arrangement has ended. But the inheritance. What inheritance? Robert's eyebrows rose. Margaret left you some personal letters. That's hardly an inheritance. They didn't know about the money. Margaret had hidden my birth mother's legacy so well that even Robert, with all his legal knowledge and financial expertise, had no idea it existed. For a moment I felt a flash of gratitude for Margaret's secrecy, even though it had caused me so much pain over the years. So, what happens now? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Now you take your belongings and start your adult life, Robert said, closing the folder with finality. We've arranged for you to have until the end of the day to pack. After that, this house belongs to the family. I am family. The words came out automatically, even though I knew how pathetic they sounded. Catherine actually laughed. Corlett, come on. You're 22 years old. It's time to stop playing. Pretend and join the real world. I looked between the two of them, these people who had shared my home for 15 years, who had sat at the same dinner table and celebrated the same holidays and pretended to be my siblings. And I realized that Margaret's death hadn't changed anything fundamental about how they saw me. It had just removed the one barrier that had kept them from acting on their true feelings. Fine, I said, standing up. I'll be gone by tonight. Corlett, Robert's voice stopped me at the door. I want you to know that this isn't personal. You're a bright girl with a lot of potential, but this family has responsibilities and reputations to maintain. We can't carry the burden of caring for someone who isn't legally our body. Obligation. Burden. The word hit me like a slap, even though I should have expected it. After 15 years of trying to prove I wasn't a burden, I was still exactly that in their eyes. I understand, I said, and walked out of Robert's office for the last time. The next 8 hours were the longest of my life. I packed everything I owned into 3 suitcases and 2 cardboard boxes, sorting through 15 years of accumulated belongings and trying to decide what parts of my life were worth carrying into an uncertain future. Most of my clothes went into the suitcases. My books, the ones Margaret had given me over the years, went into one box. My photos and personal documents went into the other. Everything else, the furniture, the decorations, the little gifts and mementos that had made my room feel like home, I left behind. As I packed, I could hear Rebecca and Catherine in the hallway talking excitedly about their plans for my room. Rebecca wanted to turn it into a home office. Catherine thought it would make a perfect guest room for when her friends visited. Neither of them knocked on my door to say goodbye. At 6 o'clock, a moving truck arrived to take my belongings to a storage unit I'd rented across town. I'd found a small apartment near the university. Nothing fancy, but clean and safe, with a month-to-month lease that would give me time to figure out my next move. As I loaded the last box into the truck, Margaret's Honda Civic pulled into the driveway. I'd forgotten that it was mine now. The one thing Margaret had specifically left to me in her will. It wasn't much, but it was transportation and independence. Robert came out to watch me drive away, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed like he was making sure I actually left. Rebecca and Catherine didn't even bother to come outside. As I pulled out of the driveway for the last time, I caught a glimpse of the house in my rear-view mirror, the place where I'd spent my childhood and teenage years, where I'd done my homework at the kitchen table and celebrated every birthday and Christmas morning, where Margaret had read to me every night and told me I was just as smart as my sisters. It looked smaller than I remembered, less impressive, just a house full of people who had never really wanted me there. But as I drove toward my new apartment, I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life grieving for people who had never loved me. I wasn't going to waste the gift my birth mother had given me by wallowing in self-pity. I was going to build something new, something that belonged entirely to me. I just had no idea how hard that was going to be. The apartment was fine for the first few weeks. I had enough money to live comfortably while I figured out my next step. And the freedom of making my own choices was intoxicating after years of trying to fit into someone else's expectations. But freedom, I learned, could be its own kind of prison. Without the structure of school or family obligations, days stretched out endlessly ahead of me. I'd applied to several law schools before Margaret died, but the admissions process suddenly felt overwhelming and pointless. What was the point of becoming a family lawyer when I'd never really had a family of my own? I tried to make new friends, but I'd spent so many years focused on academic achievement and family approval that I'd never learned how to form casual relationships. I'd go to coffee shops and bookstores, hoping to strike up conversations with stores' relationships, people my age. But I felt like I was speaking a different language. Everyone else seemed to have networks of support, people they could call when they needed help or just wanted to talk. I had no one. Margaret was gone. Daniel was a closed chapter one couldn't reopen, and the Morrison family had made it clear I was no longer welcome in their lives. For the first time in my life, I was completely alone. The isolation might have been bearable if the Morrison family had simply forgotten about me, but they didn't. They went out of their way to make sure I knew exactly how little I'd meant to them. 2 months after I moved out, I ran into Catherine at the Round grocery store. She was with a friend I didn't recognize, both of them dressed in the expensive, casual clothes that marked them as people who had never worried about money. Oh my God, Corlett. Catherine's voice was bright and fake, loud enough to attract attention from other shoppers. How are you? We never hear from you anymore. I'm fine, I said, hoping to keep talk it. The conversation short. Are you still living in that cute little apartment near the university? She turned to her friend with a patronizing smile. Corlett used to live with us, but she's been so independent since graduating. We're so proud of how well she's doing on her own. The way she said it made it sound like I was a charity case they'd successfully rehabilitated, not the girl who'd been thrown out of their house with 3 suitcases and a box of letters. Actually, Catherine continued, clearly enjoying herself. We're having a little gathering next weekend to celebrate Rebecca's engagement. Nothing fancy, just family and close friends. But I'm sure you understand why it might be awkward to invite you. I felt my cheeks burning with not humiliation, but I kept my voice steady. Of course, congratulations to Rebecca. I'll tell her you said that, Catherine said, already turning away. Take care of yourself, Corlett. That night, I sat in my empty apartment and realized that leaving the Morrison house hadn't ended my relationship with them. It had just changed the power dynamic. Now, they could hurt me without having to live with the consequences. They could humiliate me in public and then go home to their comfortable lives, secure in the knowledge that they'd never have to see my reaction. But what really broke me wasn't Catherine's cruelty. It was the realization that I still cared what they thought. After everything they'd done, after all the evidence of their true feelings, I was still that 7-year-old girl trying to earn her place in a family that would never accept her. That was when I decided to disappear completely. I finished out my lease and moved to a different city using my birth mother's money to start over somewhere. The Morrison name meant nothing. I changed my phone number and deleted all my social media accounts. I wanted to build a life where no one knew about my connection to that family, where I could be just Corlett, not the Morrison family's former foster child. I had no way of knowing that my disappearance would set other events in motion. that somewhere across the country, Daniel Chin was building a technology empire and trying to find the girl who had vanished from his life, without explanation. That he'd been searching for me for 3 years, following dead ends and false leads, never understanding why I'd pushed him away so suddenly. I had no idea that my decision to hide from the Morrison family had made me invisible to the one person who might have changed everything. But disappearing turned out to be the best decision I could have made. Because when Daniel finally found me again, when our paths crossed in the most unexpected way possible, I was no longer the broken girl who'd been thrown out of her adoptive family's house. I was someone who had learned to survive on her own terms, someone who had discovered her own worth without needing anyone else's validation. I was ready for the revenge I never knew was coming. I spent 2 years learning how to be invisible. The city I chose was Portland, far enough from the Morrison family social circle that I could start completely fresh. I rented a small studio apartment in a neighborhood where nobody asked questions about your past, and I took a job at a non-profit legal aid clinic helping low-income families navigate adoption and custody issues. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here, I was, helping other people fight for their right to family while I was running from the only family I'd ever known. But the work felt meaningful in a way that nothing else had since Margaret died. These families were fighting for something real, something that mattered more than reputation or social standing. My supervisor, Janet, was a woman in her 50s who'd been working in family law for 30 years. She had the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded me of Margaret, but without the soft edges that had made Margaret vulnerable to Robert's manipulation. "You're good at this," Janet told me after I'd been there 6 months. "You understand what these families are going through in a way that most advocates don't. Have you considered going back to school for your law degree?" I had considered it almost daily, but every time I started researching programs or filling out applications, I found myself paralyzed by memories of my old plans, the life I'd imagined with Daniel, the future I'd mapped out when I still believed I had a real family to make proud. "Maybe someday," I always answered, and Janet would nod like she understood that someday was code for when I figured out how to want things for myself again. The truth was I was stuck, not financially, thanks to my birth mother's inheritance, but emotionally. I'd built my entire identity around trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it to me. And now that I'd stopped trying, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. I went to work, came home, read books, and watched Netflix. I had polite conversations with my neighbors and friendly interactions with my coworkers, but I didn't let anyone get close enough to hurt me. I was safe, but I was also completely alone. That might have been my life forever if Janet hadn't gotten sick. It started with headaches and fatigue that she blamed on stress and too much coffee, but by the time the doctors figured out it was a brain tumor, Janet was already struggling to remember case details and client names. She needed surgery immediately, followed by months of treatment that would keep her out of the pain office indefinitely. "I need someone to cover the Morrison Foundation event," she told me during her last week at work, handing me a thick folder of documents. "It's one of our biggest fundraising opportunities of the year. Usually I handle it personally, but under the circumstances, I felt the blood drain from my face. The Morrison Foundation, you know." "Good. That'll make things easier." Janet flipped through the papers, missing my expression entirely. "They're hosting their annual charity banquet next month, and they've committed to a substantial donation to support our adoption advocacy program. Someone needs to be there to accept the check and give a short presentation about our work." My hands were shaking as I took the folder. Maybe someone else should handle this. I'm not really comfortable with public speaking. "Corlette, you're the best advocate we have. These donors need to see what their money is actually accomplishing, and you can speak about our work with more passion and knowledge than anyone else here." Janet's expression softened. "I know it's intimidating, but this is exactly the kind of experience you need if you're ever going to apply to law school." I wanted to tell her the truth, that the Morrison Foundation was run by the family that had thrown me out like garbage, that showing up at their charity banquet would be walking straight back into the nightmare I'd spent 2 years trying to escape. But Janet was sick, and the clinic needed this donation. Our adoption advocacy program helped dozens of families every year. Families like the one I'd never really had. I couldn't let my personal issues interfere with work that mattered more than my own comfort. Of course, I heard myself saying, I'll handle it. That night I researched the Morrison Foundation online, trying to prepare myself for what I was walking into. What I found was worse than I'd expected. The foundation had become Robert's pet project after Margaret's death. A way to burnish the family reputation while taking advantage of favorable tax laws. Rebecca was listed as the director of community outreach, and Catherine served as the volunteer coordinator. Their website was full of photos from previous charity events showing the Morrison family posing with local politicians and business leaders. But what really twisted the knife was their mission statement, dedicated to supporting for the Morrison family, vulnerable children, and strengthening family bonds in our community. They'd turned their treatment of me into a marketing opportunity, positioning themselves as champions of exactly the kind of children they'd discarded. The more I read, the angrier I got. They were using Margaret's memory to fund their social climbing while simultaneously erasing any evidence that they'd ever failed a vulnerable child themselves. My adoption was nowhere mentioned in their family history or charitable motivations. As far as the public knew, Robert and Margaret Morrison had raised 2 successful daughters and built a foundation dedicated to helping other families achieve the same happiness they'd created in their own home. It was a lie so complete and shameless that it took my breath away. But I also realized something else as I scrolled through years of foundation materials. This wasn't just about tax benefits or social status. This was about control. By positioning themselves as experts on family welfare and child advocacy, the Morrison family had insulated themselves from any criticism about their treatment of me. Who would believe that a family so dedicated to helping vulnerable children had emotionally abused and then abandoned their own adopted daughter? Who would question the motives of people who donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to support adoption services? They'd built themselves a perfect shield, and they were hiding behind it while accepting praise for the very values they'd never actually practiced. The charity banquet was being held at the Morrison house, which had been renovated and expanded since Margaret's death. According to the foundation's website, they'd added a ballroom specifically for hosting fundraising events, along with a private airstrip for donors who preferred to arrive by private jet. I stared at the photos of the house where I'd grown up, now transformed into a showplace for Robert's charitable empire. My childhood bedroom was probably part of Rebecca's home office. Now, the kitchen, where Margaret had helped me with homework, was probably being used by caterers preparing for events where the Morrison family accepted awards for their generosity. Everything that had once been mine, even the memories, had been repurposed to serve their narrative. But as I sat there looking at pictures of my former home, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't devastated anymore. I was furious. For 2 years, I'd been hiding from these people like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I'd been ashamed of my own story, embarrassed by the fact that I'd been discarded by the only family I'd ever known. But Margaret's letter had changed that. I wasn't a charity case or a burden or a foster child who'd overstayed her welcome. I was the daughter of Margaret's best friend, someone who'd had every right to love and protection and belonging. My birth mother had left me resources specifically so I would never have to depend on anyone else's kindness. The Morrison family hadn't done me a favor by taking me in. They'd made a commitment to my birth mother and to Margaret, and they'd broken that commitment the moment it became inconvenient. I'd been hiding from people who should have been ashamed to show their faces in public. That realization gave me something I hadn't felt in years: power. I was going to their charity banquet, but not as the grateful former, foster child begging for acceptance. I was going as someone who knew exactly who they really were behind their carefully constructed public image, someone who could smile and shake hands and give a professional presentation while knowing that their entire foundation was built on a lie. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning to survive with my dignity intact, to do my job professionally, and then walk away from the Morrison family forever. I had no idea that someone else was planning something much more dramatic. I had no idea that Daniel Chin had been searching for me for 3 years, following every lead and hiring private investigators to track down the girl who disappeared from his life without explanation. I didn't know that he'd inherited his father's technology empire 6 months earlier, making him one of the youngest Billionaires in the Republic. I definitely didn't know that he discovered the truth about Rebecca's interference in our relationship, or that he'd been quietly investigating the Morrison family ever since. And I had absolutely no idea that he'd been invited to their charity banquet as a potential major donor, or that he'd accepted the invitation specifically because he hoped I might be there. The week before the event, I bought a simple black dress and practiced my presentation in the mirror. I researched the other donors who would be attending, memorized statistics about our adoption advocacy program, and prepared answers for every possible question about our work. I thought I was ready for anything. I thought I could handle seeing Robert and Rebecca and Catherine again, could smile politely while they pretended we'd never met, could deliver my presentation and collect our donation without letting them see how much they'd hurt me. I thought I was strong enough to walk back into that house and leave with my dignity intact. I was wrong about almost everything, but I was right about one thing. When I walked into that charity banquet, I wasn't the same girl they'd thrown out 2 years earlier. I was someone who'd learned to stand on her own, someone who'd discovered her worth without needing their validation. I was ready for a confrontation I never saw coming. What I couldn't have predicted was that the confrontation wouldn't be between me and the Morrison family. It would be between the people who'd thrown me away and the man who'd never. They stopped looking for me. The man who'd spent 3 years building an empire while planning the perfect moment to show them exactly what they'd lost when they decided I wasn't worth their love. The private jet was already circling the airstrip when I arrived at the Morrison house. That night, I could see it from the parking area, sleek and expensive against the evening sky. I assumed it was just another wealthy donor making a dramatic entrance. I had no idea I was looking at my future. The Morrison house looked like something out of a magazine when I arrived that evening. Every window glowed with warm light, and valets in white jackets were directing luxury cars around the circular driveway. The ballroom addition jutted out from the fanned back of the house like a crystal palace, all glass walls and soaring ceilings that made the original structure look quaint by comparison. I parked Margaret's old Honda between a Mercedes and a BMW, feeling like I was driving a toy car to a grown-up party, but I straightened my shoulders and walked toward the service entrance, carrying my presentation materials and trying to project the confidence Janet had always said I possessed. The catering manager, a harried woman named Linda, barely glanced at me when I introduced myself as the representative from the legal aid clinic. "Thank God you're here," she said, thrusting a server's uniform at me. 2 of our girls called in sick, and Mrs. Morrison is very particular about having enough staff for the cocktail hour. I stared at the black dress and white apron in my hands. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm here to accept a donation and give a presentation about our adoption advocacy program." Linda looked at me like I'd sprouted a second head. "Honey, I don't know anything about a presentation. What I know is that we're short-staffed and the guests start arriving in 20 minutes. Mrs. Morrison specifically requested that someone from your Reddit organization help with service tonight as part of the partnership." My stomach dropped. "Which? Mrs. Morrison? Rebecca Morrison, the foundation director? She said your clinic was sending someone who understood the importance of hands-on community service." Linda's expression softened slightly when she saw my face. "Look, I'm sure you can do your presentation thing later, but right now I need you to help pass appetizers. These people tip really well if you smile. And don't spill anything on them." I wanted to argue, to demand to speak to Rebecca directly, to insist that there had been some terrible mistake, but the catering staff was already moving around me with military precision, setting up bars and arranging flowers and preparing for an event that clearly had been planned down to the last detail, including apparently my humiliation. Rebecca had known I was coming. She'd known I would be representing the legal aid clinic, and she'd arranged for me to spend the evening serving drinks to the same people I was supposed to be addressing as an equal. It was a power play, so calculated and cruel that it took my breath away. But I needed this donation for the clinic. Janet was counting on me, and our adoption advocacy program was counting on this funding. I couldn't let my personal history with the Morrison family interfere with work that helped real children find real families. Fine, I said, taking the uniform Where do I change? 20 minutes later, I was walking through the ballroom carrying a tray of champagne flutes, invisible in the way that service staff always are at rich people's parties. The guests were exactly what I'd expected: politicians and business leaders and old money families who treated charity events like social competitions. But seeing the Morrison family in their element was worse than I'd anticipated. Robert was holding court near the silent auction display, regaling a group of potential donors with stories about the display foundation's impact on local families. He looked older than I remembered, his hair gone, completely gray, but his voice still carried that same authoritative tone that had made me feel small and unwanted for so many years. We believe that every child deserves the stability and crew by 2001st in the STAFE. I love that comes from a strong family unit, he was saying to a woman I recognized as the mayor's wife. Margaret and I were blessed to provide that stability for our own daughters. And we've seen firsthand how transformative the right family environment can be. Our own daughters, not our daughters and our adopted daughter, not our biological daughters, and the firstly child we took in, just our own daughters, like I had never existed at all. Catherine was working the room near the bar, directing volunteers and making sure every detail was perfect. She'd cut her hair into a sleek bob that made her look older and more sophisticated, and she moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the Rafe world. But it was Rebecca who really took my breath away. She was standing on a small platform at the front of the room, microphone in hand, addressing the crowd of donors with the poise of a seasoned politician. She wore a navy blue dress that probably cost more than I made in a month, and her smile was bright and warm and completely fake. The Morrison Foundation exists because my late mother, Margaret Morrison, believed that every child deserves to be wanted. Rebecca was saying, her voice carrying easily across the ballroom. She taught our family that love isn't about blood relations. It's about commitment and sacrifice and choosing to put a child's needs above your own convenience. The crowd murmured appreciatively, and I felt bile rise in my throat. Rebecca was using Margaret's words, the same things Margaret had said to me about adoption and family, but twisting them into a narrative that erased my existence entirely. Our family has been blessed to support dozens of adoptions through our foundation, Rebecca continued. And we've seen the joy that comes when children find their forever families who will never give up on them, no matter how challenging things. I was standing near the back of the room, tray trembling in my hands when Rebecca's eyes found mine across the crowd. For a split second, her carefully composed expression faltered. Her smile flickered, and I saw something like panic flash across her face, but then her media training kicked in, and the smile was back brighter than before. In fact, she said, her voice taking on a warmer tone, we have someone here tonight who represents exactly the kind of success story our foundation makes possible. Corlette, would you come up here for a moment? Every head in the room turned toward me, and I felt my face burning with humiliation. I was holding a tray of dirty glasses, wearing a server's uniform, and Rebecca was calling me out in front of 200 of the most influential people in the city. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to drop the tray and run for the exit, and never look back, but everyone was staring at me, waiting to see what would happen next. Come on, don't be shy, Rebecca said, her voice syrupy with fake encouragement. Everyone, this is Corlette. She's here representing one of the organizations we support, and she's a wonderful example of how our community programs help young people build successful, independent lives. I walked toward the platform, on shaking legs, every step feeling like a walk of shame. The crowd was smiling at me with a kind of patronizing approval, rich people reserved for charity cases who've managed to pull themselves up by their bootstrap WS. When I reached the platform, Rebecca took the tray from my hands and set it aside, then pulled me up beside her with a grip that looked affectionate but felt like a warning. Corlette has been working with our legal aid partners to help other young people navigate the complexities of family law, Rebecca said, her arm around my shoulders in a gesture that made my skin crawl. She understands better than most how important it is for children to have strong support systems and clear legal protections. The crowd applauded, politely, and I realized what Rebecca was doing. She was presenting me as one of their success stories, a former beneficiary of their charity who had grown up to serve others. She was rewriting our history in real time, turning my survival into evidence of their generosity. "Would you like to say a few words about your work?" Rebecca asked, holding the microphone toward me. I looked out at the crowd of wealthy faces, all of them waiting to hear how grateful I was for the opportunities I'd been given. I could see Robert near the silent auction, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes cold as ice. I could see Catherine by the bar, filming the moment, on her phone like it was a heartwarming family reunion. And that's when I saw him. Daniel was standing near the back of the room, partially hidden behind a group of other guests, but unmistakably himself. He looked older, more polished, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than my rent for a year. His hair was shorter than I remembered, styled in a way that made him look like he belonged in boardrooms and executive offices. But his eyes were exactly the same, dark and intelligent, and fixed on my face with an intensity that made my knees weak. He'd found me. Somehow, impossibly, Daniel had found me at the worst possible, the moment of my life. He was watching me being humiliated by the family that had thrown me away, seeing me reduced to a prop in their charitable theater, witnessing my complete and utter powerlessness. I must have been staring because Rebecca followed my gaze and saw Daniel watching us. Her arm tightened around my shoulders, and when she spoke again, her voice had an edge to it. "Corlette is sometimes a little overwhelmed by public speaking," she said with a laugh that sounded forced. "It's wonderful that she's here tonight, but I think we should let her get back to her work. Thank you everyone for supporting the programs that make stories like Corlette's possible." The crowd applauded again, and Rebecca guided me off the platform with the same fake smile she'd worn throughout her speech. But as soon as we were out of the spotlight, her grip on my arm became painful. "What the hell are you doing?" she hissed in my ear. "I'm representing the legal aid clinic. We're receiving a donation from your foundation." "I know exactly why you're here," Rebecca said, steering me toward a quiet corner of the room. "The question is, what you think you're going to accomplish. Do you think showing up here is going to change anything? Do you think anyone here gives a damn about your soba story? I'm just doing my job. Your job." Rebecca's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Your job is to serve drinks and stay invisible. Your job is to be grateful for whatever scraps we throw your way and keep your mouth shut about things that are none of your friends' business." "What things?" Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "Don't play dumb, Corlette. I saw you staring at someone in the crowd. I'm warning you right now. Don't even think about causing a crowd scene. This is an important night for our family, and I won't let you ruin it with whatever pathetic revenge fantasy you've been cooking up." That's when I realized she'd seen Daniel too. She knew he was here and she was terrified of what that might mean. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, but my voice came out shaky and unconvincing. "Sure you don't." Rebecca's smile was sharp as a knife. "Let me make something very clear. You are nothing to us. You were nothing when Mother was alive, and you're less than nothing now. Whatever a little delusions you might have about this family or your place in it, tonight is going to be a reality check. You're the help, Corlette. You always were and you always will be." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing alone in a room full of people who saw me as either a charity case or completely invisible. But Rebecca was wrong about one thing. I wasn't alone. Daniel was making his way through the crowd toward me, and the expression on his face was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. He looked like a man who'd been searching for something precious that had been stolen from him and had finally found it. He also looked like a man who had the power to do something about it. I wanted to run. I wanted to hide in the bathroom until he left to avoid the conversation that would force me to explain why I disappeared from his life without a word. I couldn't bear the thought of him seeing me like this, reduced to serving the people who'd thrown me away. But before I could move, a commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. The front doors had opened and men in dark suits were filing into the ballroom. Secret Service agents moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that meant only one thing. Someone very important was about to arrive. The crowd began to buzz with excitement, and Rebecca rushed toward the entrance, her face flushed with The kind of panic that comes from having an unexpected VIP show up at your event. That's when I heard the voice that made my blood turn to ice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert was saying into the microphone, his voice tight with barely controlled excitement. "We have the extraordinary honor of welcoming a very special guest to our foundation tonight." Through the bell entrance walked the President of the Republic, flanked by Secret Service agents, and followed by a small entourage of advisors and staff. But he wasn't alone. Walking beside him, clearly comfortable in the presence of the most powerful man in the Republic, was Daniel. The room erupted in applause and excited chatter, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. Daniel wasn't just a successful businessman anymore. He was important, enough to arrive at charity events with the president. He was operating at a level of power and influence that I couldn't even comprehend. And he was here at the Morrison house on the state. Same night I was serving drinks in a uniform. Rebecca was practically vibrating with excitement as she rushed to greet the president. But I could see the confusion in her face. She clearly had no idea why the leader of the free world had decided to drop in on their little charity banquet. That's when Daniel stepped forward and took the microphone from Robert's nerveless fingers. "Thank you all for your warm welcome," he said, his voice carrying easily across the stunned ballroom. "I'm Daniel Chin, and I'm here tonight as a representative of Chin Technologies and our new humanitarian partnership with the federal government," the crowd murmured. Appreciatively, Daniel had become someone worthy of their attention, someone whose presence elevated their little charity event into something newsworthy. "But I'm not here to talk about business," Daniel continued, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found mine. "I'm here because sometimes the most important partnerships aren't between governments or corporations. Sometimes they're between individual people who choose to see the best in each other." My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. This couldn't be happening. Daniel couldn't be about to do what I thought he was about to do. "I'm here tonight to honor someone very special," Daniel said, his voice gentle but carrying clearly across the silent room. "Someone who taught me that true worth isn't measured by the family you're born into, but by the strength of your character and the kindness in your heart." He was looking directly at me now, and I could see the 3 years of searching in his eyes, the determination and the love that had never wavered even when I'd pushed him away. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel said, "I'd like you to meet my future wife." And then he was walking toward me, the president of the French Republic following behind him. While 200 of the most powerful people in the city watched in stunned silence, the Morrison family's faces were white with shock and something that looked like terror because they were finally seeing what they'd thrown away. But I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to be rescued, to be claimed, to be elevated from servant to princess in front of the people who'd spent years telling me I was worthless. I was still the girl in the server's uniform, holding a tray of dirty glasses, trying to earn my keep from people who would never love me. And now Daniel was about to change all of that, whether I was ready or not. Time seemed to slow as Daniel walked toward me, the president beside him, 200 pairs of eyes tracking their movement across the ballroom. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, could feel sweat beating on my forehead despite the air conditioning. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. If I'd ever fantasized about seeing Daniel again, and I had, it was never like this. Never with me in a servant's uniform, holding dirty glasses, being claimed like a prize in front of the people who'd spent years telling me I was worthless. When Daniel reached me, he held out his hand with that same gentle smile I remembered from college. "Hello, Corlette." The simple greeting broke something inside me. 3 years of carefully constructed walls came crashing down, and all I could think about was how I must look to him. How far I'd fallen from the confident girl he'd known in school. "I can't," I whispered, backing away from his outstretched hand. "I can't do this." Confusion flickered across Daniel's face. "Corlette, it's okay. I know this is a lot, but no." The word came out louder than I'd intended, drawing even more attention to our little drama. "You don't understand. I can't do." And then I did the one thing I swore I'd never do again. I ran. I dropped the tray of glasses, hearing them shatter on the marble floor, and pushed through the crowd toward the service exit. Behind me, I could hear voices rising in confusion. The president's security detail probably. going into high alert because someone was running away from their protectee. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't stand there and let Daniel rescue me like I was some damsel in distress who'd been waiting 3 years for a prince to save her. I couldn't let the Morrison family see me, elevated from servant to socialite in the space of a single conversation. Most of all, I couldn't bear the thought that Daniel's grand gesture was motivated by pity for the girl he'd found, serving drinks at her adoptive family's charity event. I made it to the parking lot before the panic attack hit. My chest felt like it was being crushed. My vision narrowed to a tunnel, and I couldn't seem to get enough air into my lungs. I leaned against Margaret's old Honda, gasping and shaking while the sounds of the party continued in the distance. This was my rock bottom. Not being thrown out of the Morrison house, not living alone in a strange city, not even serving drinks to people who saw me as invisible. This was it. The moment when the man I'd never stopped loving found me at my lowest point, and I was too broken to accept his love. I fumbled for my car keys, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get them into the lock. That's when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. "Corlett, please don't run away from me." Again. Daniel's voice was soft, careful, like he was approaching a wounded animal. When I turned around, he was standing a few feet away, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "You don't understand," I said, my voice coming out in ragged gasps. "You don't know what you're—" "I know exactly what I'm doing. I've been looking for you for 3 years. Why?" Question came out like an accusation. "Why would you look for me?" I made it clear I didn't want to be found. Daniel took a step closer and I could see the pain in his eyes. Because the girl I fell in love with would never have sent me that text message, because I knew something was wrong and I needed to understand what happened. Nothing happened. I just realized we were from different worlds. "No." Daniel's voice was firm now. "Certain that's not what happened. I found Rebecca Corlett. I found out about the conversation she had with me, about the lies she told you about me." My blood ran cold. "What conversation?" "The one where she convinced me you were going through some kind of emotional crisis. The one where she made me believe that giving you space was the kindest thing I could do." Daniel's jaw tightened with anger. "She played us both, and we were too young and too trusting to see it." I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. "She talked to you 2 days before you sent me that text. She came to my dorm room crying, saying you'd been having panic attacks and talking about hurting yourself. She said your family was worried about you, that you were becoming that obsessed with our relationship in an unhealthy way." The words hit me like physical blows. "And you believed her?" I was 20 years old and terrified that I was somehow damaging the person I loved most. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. "She showed me photos of you from high school before we met and you looked so different. Thinner, sadder," she said. "That's what you looked like when you got too attached to people." I remembered those photos, the ones from my junior year when I'd been struggling with an eating disorder, trying to make myself smaller and more acceptable to my adoptive family. Rebecca had kept them specifically for moments like this. I realized evidence of my instability that she could use whenever she needed to control the narrative. "She said you'd asked her to talk to me because you were too embarrassed to break up with me yourself," Daniel continued. "She said you thought I was getting too serious, and it was scaring you, so you just gave up on me." The accusation came out bitter and raw. "I gave you the space I thought you needed to get better, and when you sent me that message 2 days later, it seemed to confirm everything Rebecca had told me." Daniel ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from when he was frustrated or trying to solve a difficult problem. "I tried to respect your decision, but something about it never felt right. It took you 3 years to figure that out. It took me 3 years to build enough resources to find you properly." Daniel's expression hardened. "Do you know how difficult it is to track someone who's completely changed their life? No social media, new phone number, different city, different job. You disappeared like you never existed. Maybe because I didn't want to be found. Or maybe because you believed the same lies Rebecca told me." Daniel stepped closer, close enough that I could see the determination in his eyes. "I hired investigators, Corlett. Know about the will reading. I know about them throwing you out with nothing but a box of letters. I know about Margaret's real letter and your birth mother's inheritance. I felt exposed, like he'd been watching my life from a distance without my knowledge. You had no right. I had every right. You're the woman I love, and I let someone else's lies convince me to abandon you when you needed me most. Daniel's voice was fierce now, protective. I failed you once. I'm not going to fail you again. This isn't failure, I said, gesturing toward the party still going on inside the house. This is pity. You saw me serving drinks to the people who threw me away, and you felt sorry for me. Is that what you think this is? Daniel's expression shifted to something like disbelief. Corlett, do you have any idea who I am now? Some billionaire who can afford to arrive with the president. I'm the CEO of the largest sustainable technology company in the Republic. I have partnerships with governments and corporations around the world. I could have any life I wanted with anyone I wanted. Daniel's voice softened. And all I've wanted for 3 years is the chance to tell you that losing you was the biggest mistake of my life. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to fall into his arms and let him carry me away from all of this. But the girl in the server's uniform couldn't reconcile herself with the idea of being claimed by a billionaire. You don't know who I am anymore, I said quietly. You fell in love with someone who doesn't exist. I fell in love with someone who is kind and brilliant and strong enough to overcome anything life threw at her. Daniel reached for my hand, and this time I let him take it. The woman who just gave a professional presentation, while being publicly humiliated by her former family, is exactly the same person I fell in love with. In college, I didn't give a presentation. I served drinks and got called out like a charity case. You stood on that platform with dignity, while they tried to use you as a prop for their narrative. You looked them in the eye and didn't flinch, even when they were rewriting your history in real time. Daniel's grip on my hand tightened. That takes more strength than most people will ever have. I ran away from you in front of 200 people. You protected yourself when you felt overwhelmed. There's nothing wrong with that. I wanted to argue with him to point out all the ways I'd failed and fallen short of the person he thought I was. But standing there in the parking lot holding hands with the man who'd spent 3 years looking for me, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret died. I felt like I belonged somewhere, but that feeling was shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps. Rebecca and Catherine were walking toward us, their faces set in identical expressions of cold fury. Behind, Robert and 2 men I didn't recognize were following at a distance. I think you've caused enough of a scene for one evening, Rebecca said, her voice pitched to carry back to the house. Maybe it's time for you to leave before you embarrass yourself further. Daniel stepped slightly in front of me, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the Morrison women. I don't believe we've been introduced, he said, his voice perfectly polite, but with an underlying edge of steel. I'm Daniel Chin. We know who you are, Catherine said, her tone dismissive. What we don't understand is why you're wasting your time with someone who clearly can't handle being in civilized company. Excuse me, look at her. Rebecca gestured toward me, with barely concealed disgust. She's having some kind of breakdown in a parking lot, running away from help, making a spectacle of herself in front of important people. This is exactly the kind of behavior we were trying to protect you from in college. I felt the familiar shame rising in my chest, the voice that had whispered for years that they were right about me, that I was too damaged, too unstable, too much work for anyone to love. But Daniel's reaction was immediate and devastating. You're the ones who interfered with our relationship in college, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. You're the ones who convinced a 24-year-old girl that she wasn't worthy of love. We protected our family from someone who was compared as clearly using your family. Daniel's laugh was sharp and cold. Corlett was your family. She was the daughter Margaret chose to love, and you threw her away the moment it became inconvenient. Robert stepped forward, clearly trying to take control of the situation. Mr. Chin, I think there's been some misunderstanding about. The only misunderstanding is mine. Daniel cut him off. I understood that you were a charitable family dedicated to helping vulnerable children. What I found instead was a group of people who emotionally abused a child for 15 years and then abandoned her when she became an adult. That's a very serious accusation, Robert said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone I remembered from childhood. I'd be careful about making statements like that without evidence. Daniel smiled. And it wasn't a pleasant expression. Oh, I have evidence. I have recordings of the depression, conversations Rebecca had with me in college. I have financial records showing how Margaret's inheritance was distributed. I have witnessed statements from neighbors and family friends about how Corlett was treated differently from your biological daughters. The Morrison family's faces went white. More importantly, Daniel continued, I have the resources to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of people you really are. Is that a threat? Rebecca's voice was shaking with anger. It's a promise. You had your chance to be a real family to the promise. Little girl Margaret entrusted to your care. You failed. And now the whole world is going to know exactly how you failed. That's when Robert made his biggest mistake. You think you can intimidate us with your money and your connections? He sneered. You think showing up here with the president makes you untouchable? We've been building our reputation in this community for decades. No one is going to believe some outsider's version of events over ours. Daniel's expression went deadly calm. Would you like to test that theory? And that's when I realized that this confrontation wasn't spontaneous. Daniel hadn't just happened to arrive at the Morrison Foundation event with the president. He'd planned this moment, orchestrated it with the precision of someone who understood exactly how power worked in circles like this. The Morrison family had finally picked a fight with someone who had the resources to fight back. But as I stood there watching the people who'd raised me face off against the man who loved me, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I didn't want to be rescued. I wanted to stand up and fight for myself. And that realization was about to change everything. Stop. The word came out of my mouth with such force that everyone froze. Daniel stopped, mid-sentence in his verbal destruction of Robert. Rebecca and Catherine stopped there, whispered, strategizing. Even the distant sounds of the party seemed to quiet. For the first time in my life, I had commanded the attention of the Morrison family, not through achievement or desperation, but through sheer presence. Just stop, I said again, stepping out from behind Daniel's protective stance. All of you. Daniel looked at me with concern. Corlett, you don't have to. Yes, I do. I turned to face him. This man who'd spent 3 years and probably millions of dollars trying to find me, trying to rescue me from a situation I'd been too broken to escape myself. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment they interfered with our relationship, Daniel said, his voice still tight with anger. The moment they convinced you that you weren't worthy of love. They didn't convince me of anything. The words surprised me as much as they surprised everyone else. They just confirmed what I already believed about myself. Rebecca stepped forward, sensing an opportunity. See, even she admits I'm not finished. My voice cut through hers like a blade, and she actually stepped back. You don't get to speak for me anymore. None of you do. I looked around at the faces surrounding me. The Morrison family, united in their shared history of making me feel small. Daniel radiating protective fury and the kind of power that comes from unlimited resources. The distant sounds of a charity event built on lies about family and love and belonging. For 25 years, I'd been letting other people define who I was. The grateful adopted daughter. The charity case. The girl who tried too hard. The woman who wasn't worth fighting for. The victim who needed rescuing. But standing there in that parking lot, I realized something that changed everything. I was done being defined by other people's limitations. You want to know what really happened to me? I said, looking directly at Robert. You want the truth about why I disappeared and why I ended up serving drinks at your charity event? Corlett. Catherine's voice had taken on a warning tone. I don't think this is the time. This is exactly the time. I could feel power building in my chest. The same feeling I'd Had when I won debate competitions in high school. When I'd argued cases at the legal aid clinic. The feeling of knowing I was right and having the courage to say so. I disappeared. Because I believed your lies about what I was worth. I believed that I was a burden. That I didn't deserve love. That I should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection anyone threw my way. I took a step toward Rebecca and she instinctively backed away. But you know what? You were wrong about everything. We gave you opportunities most people could only dream of. Robert started. You gave me conditional acceptance based on how well I performed for you. I cut him off. You gave me a home as long as I stayed grateful and invisible and didn't ask for too much. You gave me a family name that you took away the moment it became inconvenient. We couldn't have legally adopted you even if we'd wanted to, Catherine said, desperation creeping into her voice. The paperwork was fine. My voice was steady now. Certain. I had it investigated when I found Margaret's letter. You could have finalized the adoption at any time. You chose not to because you wanted to maintain the ability to get rid of me if it suited your purposes. The silence that followed was deafening. You kept me in legal limbo for 15 years, I continued. Not because of bureaucratic complications, but because you wanted an escape clause. You wanted to be able to claim me when it made. You look good and discard me when it didn't. That's not, Rebecca started. It's exactly true, and you know it. I turned to Daniel, who was watching me with something like awe. And you spent 3 years looking for me because you felt guilty about believing Rebecca's lies. But the truth is, even if she hadn't interfered, our relationship probably wouldn't have worked. Pain flashed across Daniel's face. Corlett, not because we didn't love each other, but because I didn't love myself. I was so desperate to be chosen by someone, anyone, that I would have suffocated you with my need for validation. I felt tears starting, but my voice remained strong. Rebecca didn't destroy our relationship. She just revealed how fragile it already was. That's not fair to yourself, Daniel said quietly. It's honest, and honesty is something I've been avoiding for a long time. I look back at the Morrison family, these people who had shaped me through their rejection and neglect. You want to know what your real to mistake was? It wasn't throwing me out. It wasn't even the years of emotional abuse. We never abused, Robert protested. Your mistake was thinking that breaking me would make me disappear. I smiled and I could see fear flicker across their faces. But broken things can be rebuilt. And when you rebuild yourself from the ground up, you get to choose what you're made of. I walked over to Margaret's Honda and leaned against it, feeling the solid reality of something that was mine, something I'd earned through my own choices. For 3 years, I've been hiding from you because I was ashamed that I wasn't enough for the only family I'd ever known, ashamed that I'd failed at belonging somewhere. I laughed and the sound was lighter than anything I'd felt in years, but I'm not ashamed anymore. Corlett? Rebecca's voice was different now and certain. Whatever you think you're going to accomplish here, I'm not going to accomplish anything here. I'm going to leave the same way I left 3 years ago, but this time, I'm not running away from you. I stood up straighter, feeling like I was finally inhabiting my full height. I'm walking away from you. There's a difference. And what's the difference? Robert asked, his voice tight with the control he was losing. When you run away, you're still letting the other person have power over you. When you walk away, you're taking your power back. I looked at each of them in turn. These people who had loomed so large in my life for so long. You don't get to define me anymore. You don't get to use me as a prop in your charity theater. You don't get to rewrite history to make yourselves look better. And what exactly do you think you can do about it? Catherine's voice had taken on the cough, sneering tone I remembered from childhood. That's when I smiled. Really smiled for the first time in 3 years. I'm going to tell the truth. The fear that flashed across their faces was immediate and unmistakable. You think anyone will believe you over us? Rebecca asked, but her voice was shaking now. I think people will believe evidence. I pulled out my phone and held it up like the recording I've been making of this entire conversation. The color drained from Robert's face. You can't. I can. And I did. Every word you've said tonight has been recorded. Every lie, every admission, every moment of cruelty. I looked at Daniel, who was watching me, with something that looked like pride. And unlike 3 years ago, I'm not facing you alone. We can fight this, Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. We have lawyers' resources. You have lawyers, Daniel said, speaking for the first time since I'd taken control of the conversation. I have lawyers and unlimited funding and political connections and a media empire that spans 6 countries. Which do you think is going to win that fight? But I held up my hand to stop him. Actually, Daniel, I don't need your lawyers or your media empire. What? Do you mean? I mean, I have something better than resources or connections or power. I looked at the Morrison family. These people who had spent decades building their reputation on a foundation of lies. I have the truth, and the truth has a way of spreading all by itself. I turned back to Daniel. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for caring enough to spend 3 years looking. But I don't need to be rescued anymore. Then what do you need? For the first time since he'd walked toward me in that ballroom, I felt ready to answer that question. Honestly, I need to know if you're interested in building something new with someone who's... I finally figured out who she really is. I took a deep breath. Not the grateful adopted daughter, not the charity case, not the victim who needs saving. Just me. Corlette, the woman who's strong enough to walk away from people who never deserved her in the first place. Daniel's smile was the same one I remembered from college, warm and genuine and full of possibilities. I've been waiting 3 years to meet that woman. Well, I said, turning back to the college Morrison family one last time. You're about to. I got in Margaret's Honda and started the engine. Through the windshield, I could see Robert, Rebecca, and Catherine standing there in shock, finally understanding that they'd lost the only power they'd ever had over me, the power to make me believe I needed them. Daniel was walking toward his own car, probably the sleek black sedan I'd noticed near the entrance. As I pulled out of the parking space, he fell into formation behind me, and I realized this was how it should be. Not him rescuing me, but both of us choosing to drive toward a future we'd build together. In my rearview mirror, I could see the Morrison house glowing with warm light, full of people who thought they were celebrating charity and family values. But I knew the truth now. The real celebration was happening outside, in the darkness where broken things were finally learning how to heal. Tomorrow, I would call Janet and tell her about the recording. I would suggest that our legal aid clinic might want to investigate the Morrison Foundation's claims about their adoption advocacy work. I would start the process of making sure other vulnerable children didn't fall through the same cracks I had, but tonight I was just driving toward a future where I got to choose who I was and who I loved, and how I defined family. For the first time in my life, I was free. The revenge I'd never planned was about to begin, and it would be sweeter than anything I could have imagined, because it wouldn't be motivated by anger or hatred or the desire to hurt people who had hurt me. It would be motivated by love for the children who needed protection, love for the families who deserved honesty, and love for the woman I'd finally become. The Morrison family was about to discover that the quiet girl they'd thrown away had grown into someone with the power to expose their lies to the world. But that reckoning would have to wait until tomorrow. Tonight I had a future to claim. I made it 3 blocks before I realized I couldn't leave. Not because I was afraid or because I needed the Morrison family's approval. I was done with both of those things forever. But sitting at a red light, watching Daniel's headlights in my rearview mirror, I had a moment of perfect clarity. There were 200 people inside that house, right now writing checks to support a foundation built on lies. Donors who believed they were right, funding adoption advocacy programs run by a family that understood the importance of love and commitment. Politicians and business leaders who were about to endorse an organization that emotionally abused children while claiming to protect them. If I drove away now, if I let the Morrison family continue their charitable theater without consequences, how many other vulnerable children would suffer? How many other adoptees would grow up believing they weren't worthy of real love because the people claiming to help them were frauds? I pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car. Daniel parked behind me and approached, cautiously, probably wondering if I was having another panic attack. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm perfect," I said, and I meant it. "But I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always. Why did you really come here tonight with the Beth president with all that power and pageantry? What were you planning to do?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, and I could see him weighing his words carefully. "I was planning to destroy." "How? How? Public humiliation, financial investigation, media exposure. I have enough evidence of their fraud and tax evasion to shut down their foundation and possibly send Robert to prison." His expression was grim. "I wanted them to pay for what they did to you." "And what about the other families they claim to help? The adoption programs they fund? The children who be adoption might actually benefit from their work, assuming any of it is real." Daniel's face fell slightly. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I was focused on justice for you. That's what I thought." I smiled at him. This man who had been willing to use his considerable power to avenge wrongs done to someone he loved. "And that's why I need to go back in there. Corlett, you don't have to face them again. We have evidence to destroy them." "Yes, but destruction isn't justice." I pulled out my phone and looked at the recording I'd made in the parking lot. "Justice is making sure the truth comes out in a way that protects other people from experiencing what I went through." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that 200 influential people are inside that house right now, ready to write checks and make commitments to support adoption advocacy. They deserve to know who they're really supporting." I straightened my shoulders, feeling a calm determination settle over me, and I'm thinking that the president of the Brasses Republic probably has some opinions about charitable fraud. Daniel's expression shifted from concern to something like admiration. "You want to expose them publicly tonight in front of Comparant everyone?" "I want to tell the truth publicly. There's a difference. The Morrison family will never recover from that kind of exposure." "Good. They don't deserve to recover." I met his eyes. "But the children they claim to help do deserve honest advocates. And the donors in there deserve to know where their money is really going." Daniel nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to get me back inside that house, preferably without the Morrison family realizing what's happening until it's too late." I paused. "Can you do that?" "Corlett," I arrived. "They're here tonight with the President of the Republic. I think I can manage to get you into a charity banquet." We drove back to the Morrison house in convoy, and this time I felt like I was returning as myself instead of running away from who I used to be. Daniel's security detail, which I hadn't even noticed before, smoothly coordinated our re-entry into the event. The ballroom was still full of donors and dignitaries, but the energy had shifted. People were clustered in small groups, clearly discussing the dramatic scene they'd witnessed earlier. I could see Rebecca near the silent auction, her smile looking increasingly strained as she tried to maintain normal conversation with people who kept glancing toward the entrance. Daniel appeared at my side as we entered, offering his arm in a gesture that felt like partnership rather than protection. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "if I could have your attention for just a moment." The conversations died immediately. When a billionaire asks for attention at a charity event, people listen. I know there was some confusion earlier this evening, and I wanted to take a moment to clarify what happened. Daniel's voice was warm and professional, the tone of someone accustomed to addressing important audiences. "As many of you know, I've been working with the federal government on initiatives to improve transparency and accountability in charitable organizations." I could see Robert's face going pale across the room. Rebecca had stopped pretending to smile entirely. "Tonight, Trankiver Bread, I know Never Walk It, had the honor of bringing the president here to learn about the Morrison Foundation's work," Daniel continued. "But more importantly, I wanted him to meet someone who embodies everything we hope to achieve in adoption advocacy." He turned to me, and I felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes settling on my shoulders. But instead of the crushing pressure I'd felt earlier, this attention felt different. These people weren't looking at me as a prop in the Morrison family's narrative. They were looking at me as someone Daniel Chin considered worth their attention. "I'd like to formally introduce Corlett Morrison," Daniel said, using the name I'd carried for 22 years, but had never felt entitled to claim. A brilliant advocate for adoption rights, who has dedicated her career to helping vulnerable children find real, lasting families. The applause was polite, but confused. These people still didn't understand why the evening's honored guest was the same woman who'd been serving drinks earlier. "What makes Perfided Corlett uniquely qualified to speak about adoption," Daniel continued, "is that she was adopted herself by the Morrison family 22 years ago." The confusion in the room was palpable now. I could see people turning to look at Robert and Rebecca, trying to understand why they hadn't mentioned having an adopted daughter during their presentation about family values. "Corlett," Daniel said, offering me the microphone, "would you like to tell everyone about your experience with the family that runs this foundation?" I took the microphone, and, for a moment, the ballroom was so quiet, I could hear the ice shifting in someone's drink glass. "Thank you, Daniel," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "And thank you all for supporting adoption advocacy. It's work that's very close to my heart." I looked across the room, at the faces watching me, politicians and business leaders and philanthropists who genuinely wanted to make a difference in children's lives, people who deserve to know the truth about where their money was going. "I want to tell you a story." I began about a 7-year-old girl who was adopted by a family that promised to love her as their own. A family that told her she was just as important as their biological children, just as worthy of support and affection and belonging. The room was completely silent now. In my peripheral vision, I could see the past Morrison family clustered together near the silent auction, their faces frozen in expressions of growing horror. For 15 years, that little girl tried to earn her place in that family. She got perfect grades and won academic competitions, and never asked for anything she didn't absolutely need. She was grateful for every birthday party and Christmas morning and family vacation, even when she could feel that she was being tolerated rather than celebrated. I paused, looking directly at Margaret's portrait, which hung prominently near the foundation's mission statement. The only person in that family who truly loved her was her adoptive, and when that mother died suddenly, the little girl discovered that her legal adoption had never been finalized, that for 15 years she had been nothing more than a long-term foster placement with an escape clause. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. I could see several people turning to stare at Robert, whose face had gone completely white. 3 days after the funeral, I continued, my voice growing stronger. The family threw her. They told her she had never really belonged there, that she was a burden they had tolerated out of charity to their deceased mother and wife. The murmurs were getting louder now, and I could see anger beginning to register on several faces. "That little girl was me," I said, letting the words settle over the room like a bomb. "And this family, the Morrison family, who are asking for your donations to support adoption advocacy, are the same people who emotionally abused an adopted child for 15 years and then abandoned her the moment at 10 became convenient." The silence that followed was deafening. "But that's not even the worst part," I continued, pulling out my phone. "The worst part is that they've built this entire foundation on a lie. They've convinced you that they understand family values and child welfare, when the truth is that they've spent decades perfecting the art of making children feel unwanted." "That's enough." Robert's voice cut across the room, but it sounded weak and desperate rather than authoritative. "You have no right to." "I have every right," I said, my voice carrying clearly over his interruption, "because I have proof." I held up my phone. 20. In the parking lot outside this house, I recorded a conversation with the Morrison family. A conversation where they admitted that my adoption was never finalized because they wanted to maintain the ability to get rid of me, where they revealed that their entire charitable persona is performance designed to hide their real treatment of vulnerable children. The room erupted in angry voices. I could see the president's security detail moving closer, probably concerned about the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Would you like to hear it?" I asked, and the room fell silent again. Without waiting for an answer, I played the recording. Robert's voice filled the ballroom. You've used our name. But legally, you were only ever a foster placement with intention to adopt. The final adoption decree was never processed. Then, Catherine, legally you're not a Morrison. You never were. You were a foster child in our care. And now that you're an adult, that arrangement has ended. And Rebecca, your job is to serve drinks and stay invisible. Your job is to be grateful for whatever scraps we throw your way and keep your mouth shut about things that are none of your business. The recording, played for 3 full minutes, capturing every cruel word, every admission of deliberate legal manipulation, every moment of callous disregard for a child they had claimed to love. When it ended, the silence in the room was absolute. Then the President of the Republic stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, he said, his voice carrying the authority of the most powerful office in the world. I came here tonight to learn about your foundation's work in adoption advocacy. What I've learned instead is that you've been committing charity fraud while abusing the very children you claim to protect. Robert tried to speak, but no words came out. The federal government takes a very dim view of organizations that misrepresent their charitable work. While accepting tax-exempt status, the president continued, you can expect a full investigation into your foundation's activities starting tomorrow morning. The room erupted in chaos. Donors were demanding their money back. Politicians were distancing themselves from the foundation. Several people were already on their phones, probably calling lawyers or reporters or both. But I wasn't watching the Morrison family's public destruction. I was watching Daniel, who was looking at me with an expression of complete admiration. How do you feel? He asked quietly. Free, I said and meant it. Rebecca was crying now, her carefully constructed public persona completely shattered. Catherine was trying to argue with a reporter, who had appeared from somewhere, insisting that the recording was taken out of context. Robert was standing frozen in the middle of the chaos, finally understanding that his reputation was beyond saving. But I felt no satisfaction in their humiliation, no joy in their downfall, just a deep sense of completion, like a story that had finally reached its proper ending. What happens now? Daniel asked. I looked around the room at the donors and politicians and business leaders who were learning the truth about the people they had trusted, people who would now be more careful about vetting charitable organizations, more demanding of accountability from the causes they supported. Now, I said, real advocates get the chance to do the work that needs to be done. Honest organizations get the funding that was going to. Frauds and children in the system get protection from people who actually understand what family means. Daniel smiled. And what about us? I took his hand, feeling the solid reality of someone who had chosen to love me, not despite my history, but because of who I had become, through surviving it. Now we build something real, I said. Something honest, something that would make Margaret proud. As we walked out of the Morrison house together, past the crated chaos of a foundation collapsing under the weight of its own lies, I realized that this was what justice looked like. Not revenge or destruction, but truth told in service of protecting others. The Morrison family would face the consequences of their choices. Other children would be safer, because of their exposure. And I would finally be free to build the life I deserved with someone who had never stopped believing I was worth fighting for. Behind us, the house where I spent my childhood was full of people demanding accountability and transparency and real commitment to the values they had thought they were supporting. Ahead of us was a future we would write together, built on truth and chosen love, and the understanding that family isn't about blood or law or obligation. It's about people who choose to see the best in each other and refuse to give up, even when the world tries to convince them they don't belong anywhere. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I belonged, and it wasn't a place. It was a choice I was finally strong enough to make. 6 months later, I was standing in front of a congressional subcommittee explaining how charity fraud in adoption services could be prevented through better oversight and transparency requirements. The Morrison Foundation had collapsed within 2 weeks of that disastrous charity banquet. The federal investigation revealed financial irregularities going back years, including donations that had been diverted to personal expenses and programs that existed only on paper. Robert was facing criminal charges, for fraud and tax evasion. Rebecca and Catherine were dealing with civil lawsuits from donors, who demanded restitution. But more importantly, the exposure of their lies had led to real reforms in how adoption advocacy organizations were monitored and funded. Other families had come forward with their own stories of abuse and neglect by supposedly charitable organizations. Children who might have fallen through the same cracks I did were now better protected. "Miss Morrison," the committee chair said. "Or do you prefer Miss Chin now?" "Miss Morrison. Actually, it's Dr. Chin," Daniel said from the gallery behind me, and I could hear the pride in his voice. She finished her law degree in record time and just defended her dissertation on adoption law reform. I smiled back at my husband of 3 months, but Corlette is fine. The hearing went well. My testimony, along with the evidence we'd gathered about systemic problems in charity oversight, resulted in new legislation that would require independent auditing of adoption advocacy organizations. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Afterward, Daniel and I walked out of the Capitol building together, past reporters who wanted to know about our foundation's next initiative. Yes, we'd started our own foundation, the Chin Morrison Institute for Adoption Advocacy, dedicated to providing real support for adoptive families and ensuring that children's needs always came first. We funded legal aid clinics, family counseling services, and educational programs that taught adoptive parents how to help children heal from trauma instead of expecting them to be grateful for basic care. "How does it feel to be Dr. Chin?" Daniel asked as we got into the car. "Like I finally know who I am," I said. "And like I have the tools to help other people figure out who they are too." It had been a whirlwind 6 months. After the truth about the Morrison family came out, I'd received dozens of calls from other adult adoptees who had similar experiences with families who treated adoption as charity rather than commitment. Their stories broke my heart and fueled my determination to change the system that had failed us all. I'd gone back to school immediately, using my birth mother's inheritance to fund an accelerated law program focused on family law and children's rights. Daniel had supported me through every late night of studying and the moment of imposter syndrome when I worried I wasn't smart enough or strong enough to make a real difference. But the work felt like coming home in a way that nothing else ever had. When I helped a family navigate a complicated adoption process, when I wrote policy recommendations that would protect vulnerable children, when I stood in front of lawmakers and told them why these issues mattered, I felt like I was using everything I'd learned from my own experience to build something better. "There's something I want to show you," Daniel said, as we drove through the city. "What kind of something?" "The kind that requires you to trust me and not ask too many questions." I laughed. "After everything we've been through, I think I can manage that." He drove us to a neighborhood I didn't recognize, full of restored Victorian houses with wraparound porches and mature trees. When he pulled into the driveway of a pale yellow house with white trim and a swing on the front porch, I felt my breath catch. "Daniel, what is this?" "This," he said, getting out of the car and coming around to open my door, "is home if you want it to be." The house was perfect. Not too big, not too small, with a library that had built-in bookshelves and a kitchen that opened onto a garden where someone could grow vegetables and flowers. There was a nursery upstairs ready for the children we'd talked about adopting someday, and a home office where I could work on cases that mattered to me. The previous owners were an elderly couple who raised 6 children here, Daniel explained as we walked through the rooms. All adopted, all loved, all successful adults now. When they heard about our foundation, they insisted on selling to us. They said the house was meant for people who understood what family really means. I stood in the living room looking out at the far garden through windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light, and I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete peace, complete belonging, not because I'd earned it or proven I was worthy of it, but because I'd chosen it and been chosen in return. "So, what do you think?" Daniel asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "I think," I said, leaning back against his chest, "that 7-year-old me would never have believed this was possible. And What about current you? Current me knows that the best stories are the ones where broken. Things get rebuilt into something stronger than they ever were before. 2 years later, our house was full of the sounds of real family. We'd adopted 2 children through the same legal aid clinic where I'd once worked. Maya, age 8, whose birth parents had struggled with addiction, but who had the brightest smile and the sharpest questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether it was possible to become a lawyer and an astronaut at the same time. And James, age 5, who had been in foster care for 2 years, and who had taught me that trust was something you built one bedtime story at a time. Neither of them called us Mom and Dad yet. They weren't ready for that kind of commitment, and we weren't pushing, but they called our house home, and they knew they were safe there, and that felt like the most important foundation we could build. I was in the kitchen making Maya's lunch for school when Daniel found me there, holding an envelope with the official seal of the Department of Health and Human Services. "What's that?" I asked. "An invitation," he said, his smile wide with excitement. "They want you to head the new National Commission on Adoption Reform." I stared at the letter, hardly believing what I was reading. A position that would let me influence adoption policy at the federal level, that would give me the resources to protect children and support families across the entire country. "It's based in D.C., Daniel continued. "But there's funding for family relocation, and they specifically mentioned that they want someone who understands these issues from personal experience. What about your company? What about everything you've built here?" Daniel's expression softened. "Corlette, I've spent the last 5 years watching you turn your worst experiences into ways to help other people. I've seen you testify before Congress and write policy papers and counsel families through some of the hardest moments of their lives. If they're offering you the chance to do that work on a national scale, then we're moving to D.C. That night, after Maya and James were asleep, Daniel and I sat on our front porch swing and talked about the future, about the house we'd have to leave and the new adventure we'd be starting, about the children we might be able to help and the families we might be able to protect. "Are you nervous?" Daniel asked. "Terrified," I admitted, but also excited, also grateful. Grateful. I thought about the question, about everything that had brought me to this moment, the pain and the abandonment and the years of feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, the courage it had taken to walk back into that ballroom and tell the truth, the love that had found me even when I wasn't looking for it. "I'm grateful for the journey," I said finally. "All of it. Even the parts that broke me, because those are pie. The parts that taught me how to rebuild myself into someone strong enough to help other people do the same thing." Daniel squeezed my hand. "Margaret would be proud of you." "I think so too. I think she'd be proud of all of us." As we sat there in the comfortable darkness, I heard Maya's voice from upstairs calling for a glass of water, and James asking if someone, one of the Price, could check under his bed for monsters. Normal sounds of a normal family built on choice and commitment and the understanding that love wasn't something you had to earn. I got up to take care of our children, these beautiful souls who had been entrusted to our care, and I felt the weight of responsibility and privilege that comes with being chosen as someone's safe person. Tomorrow, I would call the Department of Health and Human Services and accept their offer. I would start the process of moving our family to D.C., where I could work to make sure that adoption meant what it was supposed to mean: permanent love, unconditional commitment, and the understanding that every child deserves to be wanted. But tonight, I was just a woman who had learned that family isn't about blood or law or perfect circumstances. Family is about people who choose to see the best in each other and refuse to give up even when the world tries to convince them they don't belong anywhere. And I had finally found mine. Hey, everyone, thank you so much for staying with me through this story. I hope you're somewhere comfortable right now, maybe with your own family around you, feeling grateful for the people who have chosen to love you. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like you didn't belong somewhere or had to fight for your place in the world, I want you to know that your story matters too. Your struggle to find belonging and love and purpose matters. Your decision to keep going even when things felt impossible matters. Please hit that like button if this story touched your heart, and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to give up on themselves or each other. Share this with someone who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. And tell me in the comments, what does family mean to you? What's your definition of home? I love hearing from you and learning about your own journeys toward belonging and love. Next week, I'll be sharing another story about someone who had to fight for their place in the world and discovered that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. Until then, remember that you belong somewhere, even if you haven't found that place yet. Keep looking, keep hoping, and keep believing that your story is worth telling. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.